is the co-author of Race Course Against White Supremacy. He'll take your calls for 3 hours on Book TV's In Depth.
In his new book, Nazi Nexus, Edwin Black looks at the U.S. corporations that he says were directly involved with the Holocaust. The event, hosted by the Park East Synagogue in New York City, is an hour, 30 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? Yes. All right. Thank you for coming out today to the Park East Synagogue, to Nahos, to hear this presentation about my book, Nazi Nexus. I know that today there are many observances all across Manhattan for Yom HaShoah, for Holocaust Day, and I am taken that all of you thought to come to this event so that we can discuss what happened during the Third Reich that created the Nazi Nexus. Really, it's significant to me that I am here speaking to you. But the real question is not why I am here. The question is why you are here and who put you here. Hitler put you here, but Hitler had help. Now, who helped him? You know that over the past decade, I've struggled to answer this question. You know that my parents were in the Holocaust. My mom was on the train to Treblinka when she was pushed out by her mother from the little window. And she was buried in a mass grave, and her leg was sticking out in the snow, and my father came upon her and pulled them out, and they lived in the woods for 2 years like Defiance. Not that group, but a different group. And I always thought it was my business to answer the questions of how it happened. Somebody else discussed what happened. How did it happen? I wrote IBM in the Holocaust, and I wrote War Against the Weak, and I wrote Banking on Baghdad, and Internal Combustion, and all these books. And on each one, I answered a specific question. And a few years ago, on a Kristallnacht, here in New York and in Orlando, I was asked to connect the dots. And when I did, I realized that the actual scope of the Holocaust, the enormity of the Holocaust, the dimension of the Holocaust was determined by American corporations, each in their own way. I'm going to lay it out for you. You could ask your questions, and maybe one of them will be able to answer you after I do, one of those corporations. Now I'm going to start at the very basic concept of the Jewish menace. What was Hitler's mantra? The Jews are our misfortune, the international Jewish conspiracy. This gave him the ability to elevate Jew hatred, religious hatred, outgroup hatred from a religious phenomenon to a global war against the Jews that the Nazis and the Third Reich would lead, and which they did lead. Now, where did Hitler get this idea of an international Jewish conspiracy that controlled the media, that controlled the banks, that controlled the military, that controlled the governments, that worked with capitalism, with communism, with Zionism? Where did they get the idea that the world was being dominated and manipulated by the Jews? They got it from the Ford Motor Company. Most people know this today, that Henry Ford was the #1 anti-Semite in the United States after World War I. They didn't know it when I wrote my book, The Transfer Agreement, in 1984, which is just being republished in the coming months. At the time, it was not known the degree to which the Ford Motor Company was involved in sponsoring the concept of the international Jewish conspiracy. Since then, there's been a half a dozen books, and it's become known. But I thought I would put a chapter in Nazi Nexus because Ford is at the basis. He's at the base of the Hitler notion that there was not just a group of people that he did hate before he knew the name Ford, but that his hatred had a place in a larger global war. Henry Ford was also the hero of one of my last books, which was on how we got addicted to oil. Henry Ford was a genius of manufacturing and a complete intellectual idiot. This guy could be suckered by anything. And after World War I, a typescript called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was shown to him by Tsarist agents, and he bought it hook, line, and sinker. He quit his job. One of the biggest names, one of the wealthiest men, one of the most powerful individuals in America. He quit his job as the president of Ford Motor Company. He bought a publication called the Dearborn Independent, and he used his mass production techniques to take pamphleting and a typescript and a whisper and a rumor and produce an international publishing phenomenon. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the International Jew. He reprinted it. He published it in both serial form and in book form. It got translated all over the world, and it went all over Germany. And it came to the attention, we're talking about 1919, we're talking about 1920, it came to the attention of Adolf Hitler, and he said, Henry Ford is my hero. And even when it came time for Henry Ford to be sued for libeling the Jews, Adolf Hitler offered to send his own shock troops to Chicago. Hundreds of thousands of copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in German were circulated throughout Germany by the carload, often with Hitler and Ford pictured on the cover. Was this the work of one man? No. This was the work of the company itself. The company, Ford Motor Company, sold the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. He made it clear you cannot just sell the Model T and our tractors. If you are selling the Ford product, you are selling the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The company financed it. The company distributed it. This was an act of corporate complicity. And so Henry Ford was able to, Adolf Hitler in the 20s was able to move forward believing he was fighting not just against a different religion, not just against a group of people who were from Poland, but an international Jewish conspiracy that stretched from New York to Berlin to London to Jerusalem. Now we move to the next step. Where did Adolf Hitler get the idea that Jews were subhuman, bacterial, that it didn't matter what religion the individual practiced. It mattered what was in the blood. That a Jew was defined not by his Shabbos, but by his ancestry. And even a Jew who had converted to Catholicism, or who had become a Lutheran, or whose parents were Catholic, or who was a non-observant Jew, that person was a Jew by virtue of his blood. And so, any member of German society could now be suspect for being biologically inferior. The fact of the matter was, Adolf Hitler wanted a master race. Where did he get these ideas of a master race? Race und Blut. Race and blood. Race and blood did not come from Germany. Race and blood came from the president of Stanford University. It was American eugenics. At the turn of the 20th century, the Carnegie Institution, which was a steel fortune, the Rockefeller Foundation, which was an oil fortune, and the Harriman Railroad estate, which was a railroad fortune, combined to take Mendel's principles of heredity and combine them into social engineering. They believed that human beings could be bred the way you breed wheat, peas, horses, pigs. And how do you do that? You eliminate the unwanted stock and you propagate the wanted stock. And which stock was the one they wanted? The Americans, from the period of 1903 to about 1911, wanted a group to inherit the world who were Nordic, blonde, blue-eyed. They didn't want the Chinese from the West, who were coming in at the end of the 19th century. They didn't want the Mexicans who had come in from the South, because after the war with Mexico, we took over half of Mexico's territory. They didn't want hundreds of thousands of East European and Jews coming in from the East. They didn't want the blacks coming out of the South during the post-Reconstruction period. They didn't want the Indians coming off the reservation. They wanted it the way it was. They wanted it the way their pioneer parents had established America, and they wanted Germanic, they wanted Nordic, they wanted blonde, they wanted blue-eyed, and they felt everybody else didn't have the right to exist. Who was behind this? Well, the Agriculture Department of the United States, because they felt that we could grow people the way we grow corn. And they set up an organization at Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island to study eugenics. This was the topic of my book, War Against the Weak. In fact, this video that we just saw was done by the director of War Against the Weak. It's now a movie and festival. And they said that only the blonde, blue-eyed stereotype is entitled to live. And this was in 1910, 1911. And what methods did they have to eliminate the unwanted? They said, we will take away the bottom tenth. 10% of the time. That was 14 million Americans. They wanted them to disappear. And after that 14 million Americans were taken away, they would take the remaining bottom tenth off. And then they would keep slicing off a bottom tenth until there was no one left but themselves. Method: forced surgical sterilization, marriage prohibition, marriage voiding, concentration camps, and public gas chambers. They even entered in 1908 legislation into the Ohio State Legislature, among many other places, to make it legal for a doctor to write a prescription that this man should be put to death. And who was to be put to death? Brown-haired white people, meaning the Appalachians, the hillbillies, anyone who they thought was feeble-minded, alcoholics, criminals. At that time, you could have a criminal you could be a criminal just for doing nothing, for being poor. They called it vagrancy. Sicilians, Mexicans, blacks, Chinese. And they said at the end of this process, we will have a master race. It'll be utopia. We don't want to hurt anybody. We want to help the world. Because we believe that you are not born into prostitution. Prostitution is born into you. You are not born into poverty. Poverty is born into you. And they said if we get rid of the Jews, and if we get rid of the black people, and if we get rid of the Chinese, we get rid of the Mexicans, we will get rid of the prostitution, the criminality, we'll get rid of disease, etc., etc. And all of this was studied in the 1920s by Adolf Hitler. The books were translated by the Nazi publishing company. He studied them in prison. And if anyone bothered to read and translate the full copy and text of Mein Kampf and study those particular passages, you will see that he specifically talks about the American legislation for eugenics and how he would pattern his new Reich society after the American model. And so Adolf Hitler took his pre-existing nationalism, his pre-existing Jew hatred, now politicized by Henry Ford, and he medicalized it. And he turned it into a race war. What was it that the Nazis were fond of saying, including Hitler's personal circle? National Socialism is just biology in practice. And so we understand that World War II was not as much a war of territorial conquest and economic plunder. It was a eugenic war, a biology war, backed up by a murderous military. And so Adolf Hitler would write fan mail to American eugenicists saying, your work is my Bible. And now the theories of Adolf Hitler, the campaigns of Adolf Hitler, the programs of Adolf Hitler were to do exactly what the Americans had legislated, had proposed, had outlined. We had concentration camps. They were in New Jersey. They were in Massachusetts. They were in Connecticut. We had marriage voiding. 27 states had racial laws against marriage. Virginia had an entire bureau to unmarried people. That wasn't even overturned until 1960, Loving versus Virginia, Racial Integrity Act. We had public gas chambers being debated by the prisons, by the mental institutions. We had tubercular milk being given out to delinquents in Lincoln, Illinois, to get rid of them, on the theory that if you gave a eugenically inferior person tubercular milk from a tubercular cow, if he wasn't unfit, he wouldn't die. And then in the 1920s, a figure no less than Oliver Wendell Holmes ruled in the famous case Buck versus Bell when they wanted to sterilize not just Carrie Buck, but her daughter and her mother. It is better for all the world to sterilize 3 generations of imbeciles. And the precedent that the Supreme Court made was vaccination for syphilis. If we can vaccinate for syphilis, we can get rid of these people. That's bacterial. That's Nazi Untermenschen. Oliver Wendell Holmes. In fact, when the Nazis were brought to Nuremberg, they quoted Oliver Wendell Holmes in their defense. They quoted the California statutes, where 1/3 to 1/2 of all forced sterilizations were done. This didn't take place in Alabama. This took place in Connecticut. This took place in Minnesota. This took place in Massachusetts. This took place in California. It actually took place in 27 states. Some 60,000 Americans, mainly without their knowledge, mainly women, were forcibly sterilized by the government on the grounds of being unfit. Their only crime was that they were designated not to live. They would have preferred the gas chambers. Adolf Hitler says, why should I wait for that? I'll just use the gas chambers. And if you study the way the Nazis went in from territory to territory, and first they identified the Jews, and they had these concepts of the full Jew, the half Jew, the quarter Jew, the 16th Jew. Where did that mathematics come from? That came from Harry Laughlin of the Carnegie Institution. The National Origins Act of 1928 in the United States Congress. He defined this, and he was given an award from the Third Reich for doing it. That is how they propounded the concept of the Nuremberg laws, based on the American mathematics, the American concepts. And this is the Carnegie Institution and the Rockefeller Foundation. There's much more on this topic, about 590 pages more in my book, War Against the Weak, but there's enough to show you that this is a dot that cannot be ignored. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, we are not talking about collaboration with the Third Reich. We are not talking about people in England who sold the Third Reich buttons and bows and traded with the enemy. We are talking about the indispensable pivots of the outlines of Hitler's Holocaust. So as long as we're on the topic of eugenics, let's talk about Rockefeller. That's oil money. Rockefeller paid millions, and so did the Carnegie Institution, millions to establish American-style eugenics in Nazi Germany and in pre-Nazi Germany. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they funded Hitler's most virulent anti-Jewish eugenic doctors, the Nazi doctors, funded by Rockefeller, funded by the Carnegie Institution, and by the way, the American Museum of Natural History had a big piece of this too. They're right here in New York. In fact, the fan mail that was sent there by Adolf Hitler personally is no longer available to be seen. So Rockefeller funded these Nazi doctors, including the #1 Nazi doctor. And the #1 Nazi doctor was a guy called Otmar Verschuur. And Verschuur believed in twins. And they believed that investigating the mystery of twins would reveal the secrets to multiply the generations of the Third Reich and to radically reduce the presence of those deemed biologically unfit to live. Now, in America, you had to find a twin here and a twin there. In Nazi Germany, Himmler said, all twins must register and report for examination. Now, Verschuur, who was funded by Rockefeller, and it was only one of many, had an assistant, and that assistant's name was Mengele. You know him personally?
He experimented on me.
You were in Auschwitz.
Yes.
Then you will know that what I'm saying is the next sentence I say is correct. You will know that when the trains came in with the dogs and the noise and with the soldiers screaming, that above the tumult, they said, we want twins. We want twins. Anybody here heard that? You did?
I did too.
Okay, we want twins. And those twins were exempted from the gas chambers for the time being. And they were sent to a barracks, and horrible medical experiments were done. They fused together their veins. They put blue eyes into brown eyes. And the world could not comprehend what kind of a monster would do this kind of experiment. But the fact is, Rockefeller Foundation knew what kind of a monster it was, because every week Mengele was filing important clinical reports, important clinical diagnosis, autopsies, and they were motorcycled to his Rockefeller fellowed Otmar Verschuur for review. And that group of people, after the war, founded a brand new science, no longer called eugenics. The new science that these Nazis founded was called genetics. Same people, same laboratories, same foundations, same money. Thank you. That's another dot, and a big one. So, we have an international Jewish conspiracy. We have Jews not worth living. We have Jews, an international Jewish menace that must be destroyed. Now, how is that going to be done? On a horse? Who took Hitler off the horse and motorized the Third Reich? GM. It was not Ford. It was General Motors. It was General Motors from Detroit. It was Alfred Sloan, the president, working through the wholly owned subsidiary Opel, which was the largest automobile maker in Nazi Germany and in Europe, who personally supervised the motorization of the Third Reich. Now, it is true that Germany had made many beautifully crafted automobiles. You can see them in antique museums. But they made them one at a time. They made them in special garages, but they did not mass produce them. And until Sloan and Kettering went to Hitler and said, let us take you off the horse and motorize you, it wasn't until that occurred that Hitler became fascinated with the prospect. He loved cars, and he thought that this was modern science, modern technology, the modern way. And Sloan said, I will restore your employment, because everybody knows that the automobile industry is the keystone of commercial economic success. I will make for you the Blitz truck for the Blitzkrieg and station them along the borders. And so General Motors was stationing the spare parts in the Blitz trucks along the Polish border in the 2 weeks before September 1st, 1939. And now you're going to have to build something called the Autobahn. And you're going to need something called oil, because you got no cars, you got no Autobahn, and you got no oil. You're going to have to go that way and that way for the oil. And you will be able to project your power all across Europe. He made these vehicles primarily for the Wehrmacht, and he made them secretly through interlocking directorships and executive committees that controlled the German subsidiary so that they could have deniability in the hope that I would not come along and tell it to you. And so, it wasn't enough to bring the terror of the Nazis over land. General Motors made the Ju-88 bombers, the engines, landmines, torpedoes on land, air, and sea. They brought hell and terror and bolstered Hitler's war against all of humanity. You must ask yourself, what kind of a Holocaust would it have been on horseback? Do not ask me to answer that question. I will leave it for your imagination. What kind of a Holocaust would it have been without an international Jewish conspiracy? Remember, Jews have been persecuted from place to place, from place to place for millennia. Millennia. What kind of a Holocaust would it have been without the master race? What kind of Holocaust would it have been in bankruptcy? Without the equivalent of millions of dollars at a time when there were breadlines in the United States. And then you may ask, well, what kind of a Holocaust would it have been if Hitler didn't get all the names? And that's where IBM comes in. IBM, the solutions company. They went to Hitler and they said, we're the solutions company. There's no solution we won't give you. And IBM was the master of information technology. The people listening to my voice today, the young people, your grandkids, they think information age was born in Silicon Valley. It was born in Berlin in 1933. What is the information age? Who can define it? I will define it for you. It is the individualization of statistics. Prior to IBM, you could count, but you could not tabulate. Now, to achieve the goals of the Holocaust required the resources of a computer. But in 1933, there was no computer. What did exist, and what all of you remember, is the Hollerith punch card. And the punch card could do pretty much what most computers could do, but slower. It stored the information in holes, punched into rows and columns. And so, when Hitler said, I'd like to know just who are the Jews, because they're everywhere, and some of them are wearing black hats and have little curls, and some of them are bankers and go to church. So, IBM, under the micromanagement of Thomas J. Watson, the president of IBM, working directly around the corner at 590 Madison, and you did not know this, but now we're here in the shadow of the IBM building. IBM developed a census. And by punching in one row the mother tongue, in another row the profession, in another row the nationality, in another row the religion, in another row the city, at the rate of 24,000 cards per hour, like that. They could identify all the Jews of Polish extraction in the city of Berlin who were engaged in the fur trade. Like that. Once they were identified, they could be subjected to the eugenic laws, the persecution laws. In fact, IBM systematized, co-planned, and organized all 6 phases of the Holocaust. The identification of the Jews, the expulsion from society. They cross-referenced all of the directories. 3, the confiscation of their assets. All the banks, all the financial institutions on IBM punch cards. 4, the ghettoization of the Jews. All of a sudden, the Jews pick up one day, they're out of their homes, the next day they're all cramped into specified flats and apartments crammed up in a slum. All organisiert. 5, the deportation of the Jews. All the trains in Europe ran on Hollerith punch cards. I interviewed the guy at 22 Pavierstrasse who ran the trains in Krakow that went to Auschwitz. And even 6, the extermination of the Jews. The Auschwitz tattoo, an IBM number. That's how it started. They always said we were never in Auschwitz. They were in Auschwitz. I found them in the phone book on page 50. I published it in the Village Voice. They were in every concentration camp. You can go to the Holocaust Museum and you'll find 100,000 books on every aspect of the Holocaust in concentration camps. Not one will mention the fact, except mine, IBM and the Holocaust, will mention the fact that every concentration camp had an IBM customer site. The name of that IBM customer site, the Hollerith Abteilung. And the Hollerith Abteilung was in the Arbeitseinsatz, meaning the Labor Assignment Bureau. It was across the gate in Dachau. It was across from the parade plots in Mauthausen. It was in Auschwitz II in Poland. It was in Buchenwald. They even developed extermination by labor. They developed a couple of different cards, all by hand, custom made, that would identify what your skills were. I'm a mechanic. I'm a bricklayer. I'm a tailor. I'm an optician. And then they would cross-reference that with all the jobs that were needed for slave labor, whether you needed an auto mechanic or whether you needed someone to build a barracks, or maybe you need some medical corps, whatever it was. They would move them back and forth across Nazi Europe and work them to death. And IBM even had a code for the destruction of the physical destruction of the Jews. Their code for every concentration camp was code 3 was death by natural causes. Code 6 was Sonderbehandlung, special handling the gas chamber. That means that an IBM engineer had to specifically differentiate between death by natural causes. They also had one for execution. They had one for suicide. And those Jews who were killed by sending them to the gas chamber, they had to print up all the cards. They had to attend to all the machines. And yes, they serviced the machines on site every 2 weeks. The machines were never rented. The machines were never sold. They were only leased. The cards could only use the IBM cards, and if anybody tried to make their own, IBM would actually sue them for copyright infringement. In the case of GM, it was Jew hatred and political goal. In the case of Ford, it was Jew hatred and political goal. In the case of Rockefeller, it was biological hatred and a political goal. In the case of Carnegie, it was biological hatred and a political goal. In the case of IBM, it was never about the National Socialism. It was never about the anti-Semitism. It was always about the money. Business was their middle name. So you have to ask yourself, you will tell me what kind of the Holocaust could it have been on horseback, without a master race, without an international Jewish conspiracy, without a biological wherewithal, and without the names in in alphabetical order. In comes the truck, out comes the colonel with a list of all the Jews in the town. I want everybody here right away. There always would have been a Holocaust without these corporations. But the size and scope of the Holocaust was actually determined by the velocity of the cooperation and contribution and complicity of these key major corporations. They're not the only ones. I didn't mention Coca-Cola with Fanta. I didn't mention Chase Bank. I didn't mention many, many, many of them. But these are the ones that had the indispensable involvement that shaped the Holocaust. These are the ones that created the unmistakable Nazi Nexus. Thank you. And now I'll take your questions. We have a mic here.
Not that one.
Not this one? Okay. I'll take your questions on any topic.
Yes.
Okay. How does this? Is it?
We control
Make it work?
It's on.
It's on. Okay. Who has a question first?
I did.
All right. Go ahead, ma'am. What is your name?
I'm Sophia.
Sophia. Yes.
I'm a survivor, of course.
All right. Just a second. We have to mic you up.
Warsaw Ghetto.
You're a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto. Yes.
Right, and other camps. But my question is, Bad Arolsen that we see now coming out in mass, is that part of IBM corporation?
Okay. The first question is about Bad Arolsen, the International Tracing Service. How did they trace them? IBM gave 17 machines.
That's my question.
The Holocaust Museum, I'm answering it, the Holocaust Museum worked for many years to liberate this massive collection of slave labor, commercial involvement, and insurance, and Holocaust insurance information. And then they hijacked it. As you all know, you've all been in the struggle to release your documents and to make it available. It's all been computerized, and they're claiming the computers can only exist in one place in their museum in Washington, D.C. So the Bad Arolsen is part of the IBM story after the Holocaust. And so yes, Bad Arolsen is part of the story.
Excuse me, but I have seen some cards, some index cards where you have letters and names. That must have come through some computerized method.
Okay. The challenge is to understand what cards were scribbles and stamped and what cards were punched with holes in them. Not every file card or index card was an IBM punch card. But the question is, when you see a file card, was it then submitted to the IBM system? The answer to that is, when it's stamped, Hollerith erfasst. When it's handwritten, when it's hand-typed and stamped Hollerith erfasst, IBM registered, then you know it was done by the IBM system. And by the way, each of these cards was individualized, was customized. Some had double 20, some had 10. The ones that sent the Jews to Auschwitz had 10. The ones that were for the Rassenamt had double 40. There were all different types of these cards. And IBM had to ask them, remember, what do you want to happen? And then they said, this is how we can do it. We can only do this far because the technology only allows us to do this much. And that's why I say that IBM co-planned these aspects of the Holocaust, because they actually gave the margins of what could and could not be done. Another question. Yes, ma'am. Just a minute, please. Let me come to you. What is your name?
Catherine, and I'm a child survivor of Auschwitz, as I told you. Anyhow, your presentation makes me breathless and speechless. Has any of this company been confronted with this? I mean, it seemed to be common knowledge what you are telling us.
Has any of these companies been confronted with this? I am confronting you. You are confronted. Let me tell you the reaction. Ford Motor Company first denied it, and then they said, Mr. Black, you are right. We apologized. They took all their records. They burned them onto a DVD, and the Federal expressed them to me. General Motors tried to intimidate many people out of revealing this story. They even tried to intimidate the U.S. Congress. And ultimately, after my initial investigation in the JTA and internal combustion, they too apologized and said, yes, we have done it. And now they're giving me electric cars and hydrogen cars to drive around to show that they really are repenting. The Carnegie Institution and the Rockefeller have indicated that they are sorry for what they have done. As for IBM, you all know that money talks and everything else walks. The IBM machine that I saw has been removed. The Holocaust Museum pixelated over the logo of the IBM machine until I got the Auditor General to remove that pixelization and to restore the original picture. The IBM machine is gone, claiming that too many people were looking at it. And they replaced it with another IBM machine, not the one you know about with the logo on top, but with a faded decal on the side. If you look at the floor, you'll see two holes in the marble where they have pulled out the original glass case and moved it in. They have been confronted, but some people prefer to confront them with lawsuits. Some people prefer to confront them with documentation, which is what I do. And ultimately, they avoid the confrontation if they have enough money. Let me take another question. Yes, ma'am. Just a minute. What is your name?
Goldie. Rockefeller, how do you say, comes from Jewish parents. No. He is a descendant of Rockefeller.
Rockefeller.
No. Yes.
Okay. First of all, it doesn't matter who his parents were, his grandparents. People said that Hitler himself had Jewish blood. That doesn't matter. What matters is this. Rockefeller money had the money, and at a time when people were standing in bread lines, gave the equivalent of millions to the Third Reich to establish eugenic institutions. May I have your name?
Just a guest here. My question to you is, you told us some horrific information about the United States local legislatures in Ohio and places like that. What connection does this have with current ideas at the time of social Darwinism?
The man asked about the concepts of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism had nothing to do with Darwin. Darwin was not involved in social Darwinism, but those who came after him applied his concept of the lower species to mankind, which was never his intention. They did use the concept of social Darwinism, but basically it was social engineering. It was a utopia. They were trying to build a utopia, and the way to build a utopia, or the Thousand-Year Reich, was to get rid of all these people who did not conform to their stereotype. If anybody knows the word utopia, its Greek roots mean nowhere. There is no utopia, but they tried to make one. Who else has a question? Let me take this gentleman. May I have your name?
My name is Mark Panker. I appreciate everything you've been doing. I've read some of your books. I'd like to talk about something I saw on television yesterday where I think it was on a Glenn Beck show, where he was being shown that today the government wants to take blood samples and DNA of children without the parents' approval. Are you aware of that?
I didn't see the Glenn Beck show last night. I've been on it several times. I didn't see it last night because I was on my way up here. But after eugenics comes a new one, newgenics. And newgenics is our 21st century version of what was done in the in the first decades of the 20th century. And it will define who has a right to live based not upon national flags and ethnic criteria, but on profitability, on whether or not you are corporately acceptable. Who is leading the charge? Leading the charge is the insurance companies, who claim that if you are ill or if your grandparents were ill, you constitute a very special risk. And so we have an Anti-Discrimination, an Anti-Genetic Discrimination Act, which was passed unanimously in the House. And as soon as you see any legislation passed unanimously in the House, you know it's going nowhere in the Senate. And I have an extensive section on this in War Against the Weak. But you should know that the concept of eugenics, the concept of what the British legislature calls the genetic ghetto, is alive and well, and it is being driven by high investment from the brightest and least bright on Wall Street and in the scientific community. And all of these people need to look back at their tradition, the tradition they may not sense, and understand that in the midst of their bright light of technological achievements, there is a dark shadow. Who else has a question? Sir. What is your name, please?
My name is Kurt. I was just wondering, what is the complicity of the German corporations in this?
The complicity of the German corporations is complete. It is well known. It is highly documented. They admit it. They pay for it. They sponsor donations. They sponsor memorials. They sponsor programs. IBM and the Holocaust was first published by a German company called Bertelsmann. The new edition has just come out from Dialog Press. What has not been accounted for is, and what is the final frontier of accountability, is the American complicity. Because these German corporations, many of whom were on the verge of bankruptcy, did not work in a vacuum. And you see, the reason that I'm engaged in what I'm engaged in, the reason this is important, the reason that Leo Rector, who I thank for inviting me here, and Nahos, and the reason all of you are involved in your mantra of never again, the reason for this is not only to gain justice for yourself, but for justice for future generations. And Representative Smith from New Jersey has held hearings with Yahoo and with Microsoft saying what IBM did in Nazi Germany, you are now doing with China in, on the Internet. I am not seeking justice just for the generations around me. I'm seeking for justice for everyone, because, as we all know, it's the Jews first and everybody else second. Who else has a question? Here's a question from this gentleman.
I was delighted with your export, and I just want to know one thing. Where were the American Jews in that time? What did they do?
Okay. That's the book I don't talk about. That's the transfer agreement. Okay. The Jews, the American Jewish community, American Jewish Congress fought. These were the Eastern European Jews. They fought like hell, and they led the international boycott against Nazi Germany. And the Jewish war veterans marched on March 15th down the streets of New York, March 15th, 1933. And at Madison Square Garden, there was the epicenter of 1 million people around the country protesting Hitler, March 27th, 1933. It was covered in the transfer agreement. The American Jewish Committee, which had been the leading defender of the Jews during all these prior decades, was very shah-shah on the issue of protesting against the Third Reich, because this time it was not Sasha and Olga who was subject to the Cossacks. It was Uncle Jaime and Uncle Friedrich in their own family who were subject to reprisals, and the same came for B'nai B'rith. But there was always the question, relief or rescue? Relief or rescue? Do you help the Jews by giving them money, or do you fight the regime and bring it down? And it's a very complicated story, and the answer that I gave you is only a fragment of the answer that I could give you. Let me go to another question. Did you have one there? I'm going to just try to go around to you. I'm going to pass this to you, a quickie, and then give it back to me. Give us your name.
Okay. Yes, my name is Esther Fall. I want to know, did the President of the United States was aware of these companies, the help in Germany?
Okay.
The second one, you mentioned Chase Manhattan Bank, and another bank, I don't recall which one were involved with that, how they were involved. And the third one, what do you think was going to be in the United States?
Okay. That's a lot of questions. The first question, what was the first question? Did the President of the United States? You mean Roosevelt? Of course, Roosevelt. Roosevelt got a lot of money from Watson and IBM for his election. You know, he didn't carry many of the areas around here for election, but he carried a lot up in his neck of the woods. Let me tell you something. I've reviewed 20,000 documents of IBM, carbons, originals, typescripts, telegrams. Whatever IBM did in Holland, in Poland, in Nazi Germany, in Portugal, the United States government was the postman. Diplomatic pouch, commercial attaches. How the heck did the machines, the census machines, get out from Nazi-occupied Poland into Romania in time for the Romanian census? The United States was actually a full partner in this. And then, after the war, when the United States, when Europe was in shambles, when Europe was burning, and when people were starving, and where families were separated, IBM came in with a war claim for lost shipping boxes and for Scotch tape. And they recovered all of the profits that were locked away for IBM through pre-agreement in Swiss banks. I have a letter dated July 4th, 1945, in which the head of the Czechoslovakian subsidiary says, I did just what you said. I hid the money in Geneva. Everything is fine. The IBM reports were actually typed on the typewriter that I have cross-checked of the U.S. Embassy in Berlin. The diplomatic pouch, as I say, was used ceaselessly. The commercial attaches. I hope that answers that question. What was the second question? Well, there were a number of banks, but let me just say this. A number of banks, It's all just finance. Just finance. None of the banks made, with the exception of maybe the UBS, none of the banks was involved in making punch card machines. None of the banks was involved in slave labor. It was just financing. And, pardon me? How'd they finance it? They financed it through spider webs of connections. For instance, when General Motors wanted to get foreign exchange to pay for its parts from Nazi Germany says, we don't have the foreign currency, we'll give you pencils and we'll give you Christmas lights and you can sell those in Latin America. When you get those monies, you can trade them off for dollars. It was done through various kinds of transfer agreements. And remember, I wrote the book, The Transfer Agreement, and I know something about that. And your third question was, what's going to happen in the United States? Leo will have to have me back another time. Who else has a question? This gentleman here.
The technicians of IBM during the war in Europe enabling the Germans to commit their crimes?
Were the technicians enabling the Germans to commit their crimes? Not only were they enabling it, we are talking about what would happen with rifles without bullets. What would happen with the punch cards, with punch card machines without punch cards? They were the exclusive printer of the punch cards. The machines had to be sent. It had to be wired. They had to train people how to use them. Remember, these were complicated machines. Not everybody could use these machines. The technicians knew exactly what was going on, because when you're in Auschwitz and you have to differentiate how to punch a card, whether a man has been hung, dropped dead, committed suicide, or been sent to a gas chamber, that takes a lot of involvement. You know, there were thousands and thousands of concentration camps across Europe in which people of all nationalities and all religions and all social segments went in and out of on a daily basis, millions of people. But the one-day population capacity of all concentration camps put together was between 325,000 and 375,000. That is traffic management. That was the magic of IBM and its technicians. Next. Another question for you.
Could you please explain where Germany got the oil and gasoline to run these trucks? Where did that come from?
Well, that's my book, Banking on Baghdad. Oh, I'm sorry. That's my book, Internal Combustion. I'm sorry. My book, Internal Combustion. They got some from Romania, but they worked with the Mufti of Jerusalem. No, they got it from British Petroleum. Anglo Petroleum Oil Company, and I've checked their archives, which changed their name to Anglo-Iranian and Anglo and Turkish Petroleum over various iterations. Ultimately became British Petroleum, and they were selling oil to the Nazis. But what was most important is that the Arabs were engineering oil to the Nazis through the Mufti of Jerusalem and encouraging the Nazis to send Jews to death camps. And this is the Mufti of Jerusalem. And I believe this is another area in which the Holocaust, which you are fighting the Holocaust Museum to include this history. Who else has a question? In the bank. Pardon me?
Jerusalem.
The Mufti.
Oh, the Mufti.
The Mufti.
Oh, no wonder.
All right. You have a question?
He was a Muslim.
Speak up.
He was a Muslim. Hussein.
His name was Husseini. He was a Muslim. Yes. Yes.
I'm the one. Good. Hi, I'm Miriam Stern. I'm really not embarrassed to say I never heard of you, I never read a book, and I'm shocked by the whole thing. And I'm wondering, how do you get your message out so that more people know, besides speaking to small groups of the converted? For instance, is there a documentary? Are you planning a documentary? And if you're not, you should.
Okay, the question is, how do we reach the mass media? Not just small groups like this. Thank you for asking your question. The reality is I do scores of events every year, and I give the message to small groups of 100 and as many as 1,500 at a time. I speak to survivors. I speak to young people. I speak to Christian groups, to Jewish groups. I speak to all sorts of groups. As for a documentary, there is a documentary out right now called War Against a Week. You can find it at waragainstaweekmovie.com. It's in the festivals. It tells the eugenics story that I spoke of, Carnegie and Rockefeller and Mengele. It is won the Best Movie of the Year award from the Beverly Hills Film Festival. I have other movies in production, which I cannot discuss at this time. I write for The Cutting Edge News, which you can find at thecuttingedgenews.com. And I also have a personal website, which you might take notice of. It's edwinblack.com. Not only do I speak to people who know this information, but the reason I speak is because there are still many people who don't know this information. And no matter what I have told you, no matter what I have published, I have only scratched the surface. All right. thecuttingedgenews.com. We reach about 1 million people a month. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Evelyn. And I would like to know, I mean, I understand now you have many sponsors, but at the beginning, who sponsored you? You have to travel a lot? You have a lot of experience?
All right, the question was, how much time do we have, Leo?
As much as you want.
Okay, good. I need some water. All right. Who sponsors me? Where do I get the money to travel? Et cetera, et cetera. I have no foundation grants. The perpetrators do not sponsor me. I'm not a historian for sale. I speak all over the country, and I'm sponsored by university groups or churches, synagogues, federations. But I came up yesterday on Amtrak using my points, and I stayed in a very inexpensive hotel, which is my arrangement with Leo, because I'm so interested to speak to you folks. I assure you, if one of the major corporate criminals decided to investigate itself, they would get the big Holocaust Museum historians. They would pay them a couple $100 an hour, and I would be on the outside. I'm not for sale. My information is not for sale, and it's objective. And when I thought that Henry Ford did a lot to get this country off of oil and into an electric car, I wrote the book Internal Combustion. I said so without compunction. When I knew that Henry Ford was the biggest Holocaust and ideological sponsor of Adolf Hitler in the early 20s, I wrote the transfer agreement and and Nazi Nexus. So it's a constant battle to tell the truth, but it's never a constant battle to have the truth be remembered. Who else has a question? I'm getting a lot of questions, but you're closer. I'm a little weak, so I'm going to ask you first.
My name is Branya. Is anybody else doing that kind of research, similar to yours?
No. Yes.
Hi, my name is Rita. I have two questions. One is, did the involvement of the American corporations in Nazi Germany change once America got into the war, or not? Because when Rabbi Weissmandl wanted to trade Jewish lives for trucks, the American and other free nations of the world didn't want to give him the money because they said they can't give money to an enemy territory. That was one question. Second.
Wait, give me that question again.
Okay. In other words, the IBM and all these different corporations were all headquartered in Nazi Germany and in Poland and all in occupied territory, but America wasn't in the war yet. Once America entered the war, did that change? Did they get out? What did they do?
What does Weissmandl have to do with your question?
It was Kastner, not Weissmandl.
Okay, whatever was that group, the working group from Czechoslovakia.
All right, do you have a second question?
Yes, the other Second question is, I've been raised my whole life, you don't buy German this, you don't buy German that. Maybe we shouldn't be buying American this or
Okay, okay, okay. Let me answer your questions. During the Hitler came to power on January 30th of 1933, the anti-Jewish laws went into effect almost immediately. The Nuremberg Laws 1937, Kristallnacht 1938. The World War II started at 6 a.m., or as some Polish people like to say, 3 o'clock in the morning on September 1st, 1939. We were not dragged into the European war until Pearl Harbor was bombed. During the initial 30s, there was no law against working with Nazi Germany. There was a boycott, yet the boycott was not only the Jewish, there was the unions, there was the Christians, there were the Jehovah's Witnesses. There are lots of people who were being persecuted by the Third Reich. In order to distance themselves from Nazi Germany, they started to run things through Geneva and through Paris and through Sweden and other areas. It became increasingly difficult to do business with Germany after 1937, but it was done. In fact, it became the question of the House Un-American Activities Committee, sometimes called HUAC, which began to investigate collaborators with the Third Reich, of which there was no greater collaborators than the ones that I have mentioned. There was no greater collaborators than the ones that I have mentioned. Even after we declared war, even after war was declared on us in December of 1941, the Americans continued to do business with these Nazi companies through intermediaries, kind of in the same way the oil companies do business with prohibited companies now through subsidiaries. In fact, I have a document that I've published in IBM and the Holocaust in which the guy says, in Czechoslovakia, well, Mr. Watson, and he handled all this very personally, we relabeled our Nazi machines as Czechoslovakian machines, and they'll never know. So the answer to your question is, they did continue to work with the Nazi regime through intermediaries. In the case of General Motors, they worked through some subsidiaries in Denmark. Your other question was, what was your other question again? Oh, should we boycott American companies? All right, look, I use IBM products. They're deadly accurate. We can't boycott companies now for what was going on then because we can't even send an email to get the boycott going without IBM involved. But I should say that many of these companies have confessed their guilt, or with the exception of IBM, or apologized. The issue of reparations is somebody else's, is a different discussion. And I would say here that, in fact, I'm going to stop for a minute. You said who else is doing this work? I don't take corporate money. So if these companies were not that big and did not have that much money to buy off all the institutions in question and certain unnamed Jewish organizations, there would be many more like me. So I am the only one, and I don't take any of their money. And that's why we need not to boycott them, we need to confront them with the truth. What they need to do is they need to take a page from their Nazi clients, confess what they did, apologize, and move on. Who has a question? Yes, ma'am. How are you, dear?
My name is Esther. I wanted to find out, after the war, McCarthyism was rampant. They were afraid of the Soviet Union infiltrating the American scene among the Jews. And of course, they paid a high price in Hollywood. But nobody ever brought on anything about the involvement of the Nazi and how many Nazis sympathizers in the United States. There was no connection, never brought out at all about the Nazis, only about the Russians.
Well, there was a lot. The reference to the McCarthy era did try to find a communist under every rock. But in the prior period, they did try to find a Nazi sympathizer under every rock. Thank you very much. This is my daughter. Thank you, sweetie. Have I ever been threatened? Do you think a guy in a golf shirt with a logo could threaten me? IBM, GM, it's just not going to happen. What IBM has been doing for the past decade is they've been hiding. They have failed to answer. They have not answered any of the Jewish organizations. They have not answered any of the leading independent historians. They have bought themselves a bunch of museums. They have bought themselves a bunch of programs. They've bought themselves a bunch of historians, and they've been able to wheedle themselves out of accountability. When the Gypsies sued them in Geneva, they fought for years with this underfunded group, and they basically didn't say we didn't do it. They said statute of limitations. I'm always here for IBM if they need to find me. Who else has a question? You asked a bunch. Let's go with this guy back here.
My name is Max. I have difficulty to understand one statement about IBM. Assuming that IBM wouldn't exist, extermination would proceed anyway, because when Germans were coming to any city in any place in Poland, they were just saying every Jew has to come to ghetto. So without having exact statistics or names of everybody, the extermination would be performed.
All right, the question is, would the extermination have proceeded without the IBM? He says that the Nazis would have come into town and said, all the Jews come to the center of the square and identify yourself. You think all these Jews are going to come in and say, hello, I'm a Jew, put me in a truck, send me to Auschwitz? This was the whole point. And first of all, I should say once again, there would have always been a Holocaust, a bad one, without IBM, without GM, without Ford, without Carnegie, without Rockefeller. But the size and scope of this Holocaust, of Hitler's Holocaust, the astronomical numbers were a function of the corporate complicity. It's one thing to come in with a bullhorn on a GM truck and say, all Jews assemble at noon. It's another thing to come in with an alphabetized list of address, the bank accounts, everything, and say, we know who you are. Everybody on this list show up, and if you're not here, we will pick you up, and if someone is hiding you, we will kill them. And don't forget, the work of IBM was not limited to statistics and counting. They ran the banks for confiscation. They ran the trains for the deportation, and they even developed a system called extermination by labor, which allowed the Nazis to work a man to death at some needed task before they would extinguish his life. Who else has a question?
They also had lists of everybody who had artworks. They knew exactly who had valuable arts.
The IBM. I'm sure they cataloged that as well. Let's get to this gentleman here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Lou. Thank you for the presentation. Really phenomenal. I just wanted to mention that we're still being heard today by the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's one of the most popular items in Arab countries, and that gives them the reason to do what they're doing.
And the question was, what about the Arab countries that still work with the protocols? Okay. The Holocaust and the war against the Jews was stopped in May of 1945 in Europe and was continued in the Middle East by the Arab countries with the help, guidance, and supervision of escaping Nazi generals, colonels, and lieutenants and corporations. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a big ticket in the Arab world, and of course was part of a continuing movement that was begun and led by the Mufti of Jerusalem. He was recommended to be slated for war crimes by the UN. That never occurred. That was in my book, Banking on Baghdad, which there are not too many copies left. The reason he was exempted is because of the oil pressures at that time. Now, those who have asked why there's a phrase in my book, Nazi Nexus, that thanks to Holocaust Museum for not including any of this information, should know that there's an unwritten rule at the Holocaust Museum that no American corporation can be implicated in its permanent exhibit. And there, you're not going to find any GM, you're not going to find any Ford, you're not going to. They've got a wonderful eugenics project. And display. There's no Rockefeller, Mengele, et cetera, et cetera. Who else has a question? Yes, ma'am. Hold, stand by. What's your name again?
Goldie.
Goldie?
Yeah. What about the people who denied the Holocaust? For example, the president from the Palestinian, he wrote a book. Nobody says anything about it. He denies the whole thing.
You mean the president from Iran? Abbas. Okay. Let me just cut to the chase. Let me just not dance around it. The Iranians are now trying to do, or the president of Iran, I should say, is now trying to do in 12 minutes what Hitler couldn't do in 12 years. He wants to destroy Israel and the Jews first, and maybe a bunch of other people second, third, and fourth. And who's paying for it? You are. You're on the mileage plan with the Iranian nuclear program. I'm paying for it. Everyone who drives a car is paying for it. Well, it's not a matter of bicycle, but I did write another book called The Plan. And that could be, thank you, and that could be read at planforoilcrisis.com. I have to tell you that the reason Jewish groups are interested in this topic is because the reason Jewish groups are interested in this topic of oil addiction. And here, I've always devoted myself to genocide, injustice, and recollecting and documenting a horrible past to ensure a precious future. In the case of oil addiction, I am documenting a precious past to avoid a horrible future. Almost everything you hear about oil addiction, alternative fuels, is from the media, from government officials, from big corporations, is either a lie, an exaggeration, or a distraction. I mean, most of you are pretty interested in the GM Volt, which is going to premiere sometime next year. But the electric car was invented in 1835, and all the cars in New York City in the early 1900s were electric cars. The hydrogen fuel cell from Honda, which is suppressing the hydrogen car and the CNG car, is the hydrogen fuel cell was invented in 1838. The first hydrogen bus was in 1934. The first hydrogen tractor was in 1956. The first hydrogen van in 1958. The German Navy has 5 submarines on hydrogen. Hydrogen is not the only thing. There's CNG, there's electric. There are many alternatives. Right now, we're on the verge of the outbreak of hostilities between Israel and Iran. And this country has no plan for an oil interruption. Barack Obama doesn't have one. McCain doesn't have one. The Democrats do not have one. The Republicans do not have one. the Iranians are constantly threatening to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, and if they do, 20% of the global supply, 40% of the seaborne oil, and some 18 to 20% of the American supply will instantly stop, and our strategic petroleum reserve will last about 2 months. And we don't even have a contingency plan for it. And so I believe that what you're saying is part and parcel, which is why new Israeli leaders like Netanyahu and even McCain here in the United States saying, we will not allow a second Holocaust. You must understand there's been a continuity of oil and Holocaust since the first days of Adolf Hitler, including when he invaded Russia. Hope that answers that. Who else has a question? Pardon me? Pardon me?
Remove the electric car.
Why did they
remove? Why they switch back to gasoline?
Why did they switch back to gasoline? Well, I documented this extensively in a book called Internal Combustion. I'll give it to you short. All the cars in the United States were electric cars. All the trucks in the United States. Did you need that connected? Oh. You need that connected? Okay. So all the trucks were electric trucks that were not drawn, of course, by horse. 1897 to about 1911. And Henry Ford had a secret plan with Thomas Edison to make an electric Model T. And this was all subverted by fire and corporate sabotage, and the forces of internal combustion won out. It's a long story. It's another 40-minute presentation, but it's in my book, Internal Combustion. And then why aren't they going back now? Why did they switch? They switched because, I have to be honest with you, they thought that the electric car was so quiet and so simple, it was for girls. And they wanted a big, manly car with a big crank and a lot of noise and everything else. And this was a marketing decision made by the people who controlled the patents back in the period between 1909 and 1914. It's very well documented in my books. But the other part of it is that General Motors headed up a conspiracy with Mack Truck, Firestone Standard, and Phillips, in which they bought up all the electric trolleys, or some 40 of them around the country, and tore up the rails and burned the trolleys and replaced them with motor buses, for which General Motors was indicted, tried, convicted, and that's the real reason why the electric car was killed. Who else has a question? The last what? It's the .com is planforoilcrisis.com. Okay, or you can go to edwinblack.com. Let me go to this lady. Yes, ma'am.
It's just a comment. My husband is a mechanical engineer. He read every word of your book, IBM and the Holocaust, and he thinks that you should focus a lot of your speeches on university engineering departments.
Well, I speak on eugenics to medical groups, to medical colleges, because, of course, this was a fake medical science, which was espoused at the highest levels of Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford. I do speak to attorney groups about international law, about all of these things, but since genocide happens to be against international law. I do speak to engineering groups about the Hollerith. I speak to a lot of IT groups about the Hollerith cards, because most of the people in the IT world understand exactly how IT works. They understand what databasing is, and they understand how easy it would be to simply identify a person's name and cross-tabulate that name against his other characteristics. I'm just going to take 2 more questions because I'm running out of chaos here. That means strength for you guys. Who else has got a question that didn't ask one before? Who else has got one? You asked one already? I'll take this one for the last one. What's your name and what's up?
Henry Grossman. I would like to know that we know that Roosevelt did his best to disturb and not to help the Jewish people send back ships to Germany to be killed, and as well as the State Department were a bunch of anti-Semites. Were they influenced by all these companies that were the enablers of the fascist regime in Germany?
The question was, were all these politicians who were engaged in certain types of passive and other types of denial and exclusion and collaboration involving the Jewish period, influenced by the corporate collaborators of the Third Reich, such as IBM, GM, etc.? The answer, ladies and gentlemen, is yes. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Investigative reporter Edwin Black is the author of many books, including IBM and the Holocaust, War Against the Weak, and The Plan. For more information, visit edwinblack.com.
All week.